Well, wasn't that terrific?
Yes, well, I looked up Mr. Nutcase Carson, and it would appear that actually you're right, the man is complete pony.
I did tell you. So what else is new?
Well, I've been researching a bit, and I can't see that there's anybody else to vote for except one man who we know we can trust because he has hair just like mine.
Oh, no. No, don't tell me.
Oh, yes. I'm talking, of course, Mr. Donald Trump.
We're going to skip that next bit and go straight into our DIY segment where someone who looks a lot like me is going to explain things about triangles.
Yes, triangles, because they're the new rectangle.
Roll it. Hey there, this DIY is brought to you by the letter T for triangle. Recently I've been asked by a number of people who have cameras, how do I improve my photography? I generally shoot in program mode, they say, and when I switch to manual mode, things don't quite work out. What I teach them is the triangle. The triangle consists of ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. Let's start with ISO. Is that the higher the number of the ISO, the more sensitive your sensor becomes to light. Now the drawback is that the higher the ISOs, the more noise can be introduced to the image, making it grainy. And digital grain doesn't look so great. So I try and keep my ISO as low as possible. Next up, we have f-stop. F-stop is how open or closed the iris of your lens is. Now the great thing about setting your iris in a camera is that you can control what's called the depth of field. So this is where you can get very deep shots where everything's in focus. Think landscapes, say f16 or higher. If you want everything from your foreground, your background, and the mountains to all be in focus. Or a very shallow depth of field, say f2.8, f1.4, where you have a very narrow or shallow depth of field, which presents a very beautiful cinematic look to some images, if that's what you're going for. So your subject will be in focus, but the background and foreground will not. And then the last thing is your shutter speed. Now in still photography, a high shutter speed has the effect of stopping things. So if you're shooting at 1/5000th of a second, you can stop water, you can stop motion. If you shoot faster than that, you can stop bullets. And if you shoot slower, you'll have the opposite effect. Think those images that you see of cars driving down the street and their taillights are streaming behind them in red ribbons. That's shooting with a slow shutter speed, and it gives you that type of effect. Now, it's the combination of these three things that allow you to create all kinds of fantastic images. And they're all in service to your exposure. The exposure, if you look through your camera, is always going to be a meter between underexposed and overexposed. And most all cameras that I've ever seen have a 0 reading on this meter bar. You might see it in your camera if you look through the viewfinder, and you will see a 0 in the middle of this bar, and then a +3 on one side and a -3 to the other. Now, as a filmmaker or still photographer, it's up to you to determine ahead of time what kind of image that you would like to create. If you want to have a shallow depth of field and a proper exposure, you'll have to manipulate these settings until you get around that 0 mark. Now with a DSLR camera, I recommend that you try and nail that 0 mark pretty consistently, because you're not going to have the latitude to be able to pull back or bring up from an underexposed or overexposed image, just given the nature of the way that these are designed. But that's another discussion. When you're shooting DSLR for filmmaking, there's one other thing you should remember. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want to shoot at 1/48th shutter speed. Well, your camera will probably be 1/50th, and that'll be fine. Once that's set, you have only two other variables that you can actually use. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, shoot at 1/50th of a shutter speed. So what's left? You have ISO and you have your f-stop. Now ISO is going to give you that sensitivity value. So perhaps in the room it's a little darker than you expected. You already have one of the triangle bits sorted out because you have to shoot at 1/50th of a second because you're shooting at 24 frames per second. So you may increase your ISO. The other option is to open up the iris, to bring it down to a 2.8 or a 1.4. But then you'll have to deal with that shallow depth of field, which can get to the point where my nose will be out of focus, but my eyes will be in focus, and then my ears will be out of focus. That can be tricky. And sometimes that can look good, and sometimes that can look very, very amateur indie filmmaking. So watch that. And then of course you can always increase your ISO, but then you run the risk of introducing noise. But that's the triangle, and that's the fun of it. So you can see that these things will take care of themselves as you design the shot. And that's the important thing, really. What do you want to shoot? And when it comes down to it, your lighting is going to take care of some of this for you. If you don't have lights, I highly recommend that you get some. Because hey, what's an image without light? Well, it's a little bit black, I think. And that's it, really. So that's what you need to learn. The triangle. ISO, f-stop, shutter speed. See you next time. Bye-bye.